Imagine you're reading a sacred book, but there's a rumor that some pages have, well, an expiration date, that some parts have been canceled by others. It's a pretty wild idea, right? But for centuries, this has been a massive debate in Islamic theology. It's a concept called abrogation, or naskh.
So that's the big question we're tackling today. Are there really verses in the Quran that are just no longer valid, superseded by verses that came later? And look, this isn't just some dusty old academic question. It fundamentally changes how the entire book is understood.
So we're going to approach this like a theological detective story. We're going to sift through the evidence in the text itself, we'll examine the historical witnesses, and we'll follow the trail of the debate to see where all the clues really point.
Now, the very first, and you could say the most important clue we need to understand is just a single Arabic word, because this entire case really hinges on what you think this word means, and that word is nesh.
So, in its most basic form, that's the definition. It's the idea that God can reveal a rule, and then later on, reveal a new one that takes its place. Simple enough, right? But, oh man, the story gets so much more interesting when you dig into what the word nas actually meant to the very first generation of Muslims.
And this right here, this distinction is absolutely crucial. See, later on, scholars developed a very specific, very technical meaning for naskh, that one rule completely repeals another. It's gone, deleted. But historical sources show us that the Prophet's companions and the early Muslims, they often use the word in its much broader linguistic sense, to simply clarify a general rule, or to specify how it should be applied, or to point out an exception. It wasn't about deletion, it was about adding detail.
Okay, so keeping that key difference in mind, let's turn to our first line of evidence, the primary source. What does the Quran itself actually say about this? People who believe in abrogation usually point to a few key verses as their proof.
And this is the big one. Chapter 2, verse 106. Honestly, at first glance, it looks like a total slam dunk. It uses the word for abrogation, and it talks about replacing a verse. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast.
Because here's the twist. The Arabic word for verse, ayah, can mean a whole bunch of different things. And depending on which meaning you pick, the entire sense of this passage just flips on its head.
I mean, just look at all the possibilities scholars have debated for centuries. Yes, verse could mean a verse in the Quran, but it could also mean the laws from older scriptures like the Torah and the Gospel. Or maybe it's talking about replacing one prophet's miracle with another. Some even argued it's a hypothetical, a conditional statement, like if we were to do this, not a declaration that it's actually happening inside the Quran. So the point is, the main piece of textual proof is, well, it's anything but definitive.
So if the text itself is ambiguous, what about the witnesses? Let's move on to our second clue and see what the Prophet Muhammad and his closest companions had to say about all this.
This is pretty striking. When you dig into the sources, there's just no authentic record of the Prophet ever pointing to one verse and saying, hey everyone, this one's canceled by that one. It just isn't there. And when his companions are quoted using the word nesh, it's often in that broader sense of clarifying something. A companion might explain a general rule and then point to another verse as an exception, but then centuries later, a scholar writing it all down relabels it as abrogation. The direct testimony for this idea of canceling verses is just missing. Our third and final clue comes from the history of the scholarly debate itself. I mean, if the evidence wasn't clear in the text or from the witnesses, what happened when scholars actually sat down and tried to make a list of these so-called canceled verses?
What happened is actually fascinating. You see this incredible trend over the centuries. Early on, some scholars made these huge claims, listing over 500 verses as being canceled. But as time went on and the analysis got more and more rigorous, that number didn't just shrink, it absolutely plummeted. The great 15th century scholar al-Suyuti, he whittled that list down to just 20. 300 years later, Shah Waliullah argued it was only 5. And today, a whole lot of influential scholars argue the true number is actually 0. The list has literally been shrinking toward nothing for centuries.
So we've looked at the verse, we've examined the witnesses, and we've followed the history of the debate. What does that leave us? What's the final verdict from our investigation, based on all these clues?
It all comes down to this number, 0. That's right. Despite centuries of intense debate and literally thousands of pages written on this, there is not a single verse in the Quran that all scholars have ever unanimously agreed is abrogated. For every single claim, there has always been a credible counterargument for how the verses could work together. The ultimate consensus is, well, it's that there is no consensus.
So you might be thinking, okay, this is a really interesting historical puzzle, but why does it matter to me right now? What are the real-world stakes of this debate?
It matters a ton.
Believing in abrogation gives you a tool to set aside certain verses, often ones that promote patience or tolerance, in favor of others. But rejecting it forces you to harmonize the entire text, to find one coherent message. It has a direct impact on Islamic law, for sure. But maybe the biggest thing is, it forces us to see the critical difference between what a text says and what centuries of human interpretations say about it.
And that really leaves us with a final question to chew on. When we see what looks like a contradiction, is the problem really in the text itself, or is the conflict actually found in the assumptions, the methods, and the choices that we bring to the act of reading?